Given the public sector
Prize winner, head of the Crick Institute, Paul Nurse. Lovely to see you, Paul. If we could actually sort of start with a sort of broader issue which has come to the fore recently. You know, a few days ago, we discovered that SAGE, the scientists who advise the government, had made a series of recommendations, including having a short national lockdown. Government ignored that advice and did other things. I'm very interested in what you think the relationship should be between politicians and scientists, because early in the crisis we had the government constantly saying it was following the science. Now many people say it's ignoring the science. What is the right relationship between a Prime Minister and his or her scientific advisers?
Well, it's a really important question, because we live in an increasingly technocratic society. We're driven by science issues. We have to get this relationship between science and politics right. Now, I think the nub of the problem is a misunderstanding about what science can deliver and how it can deliver it. We are taught at school that science is like chiselled in granite, you know, Newton's laws of motion, because that's been tested for 300 years and it works. Often, science is tentative knowledge. We don't actually quite know what is happening. And that absolutely is the case in a situation like the pandemic. And so we are feeling our way as scientists, and people are doing their best. The politicians are probably doing their best to try and interpret that. But what we need is clear communication of that science. And the one-liners, which is the traditional way in which politicians particularly work, simply doesn't work with science.
And just to be clear, and we're going to talk to you a lot after the break, we're going to go to the break in a minute, but what you're broadly saying is the idea that, you know, scientists simply deliver an unambiguously clear path is not right. What, you know, in the end, if you're a policymaker, you have to listen to the scientists, but there is an element of judgment that you have to exercise.
Absolutely right. It's the politicians who make the policy. They have to take responsibility for it. And to simply say we're following the science is a little naive, because the question is, what science are you following? If there's several sciences out there and we're not clear quite what it is and how it's got to develop, just saying we're following the science is insufficient. It's not enough. You have to understand enough about it to be able to say what the science is and why we're deciding to do one thing and not another.
So I'm going to ask you after break, who's been more damaged, scientists or politicians, by this crisis? But we'll come back and talk about that in just a second. Paul Nurse, more from him, and also from Andrea and Rosanna. Join me in a couple of minutes. Before we get on to the whole who's been damaged, most politicians or scientists, I do want to ask you about this vaccines question. I mean, as a scientist, would you encourage people to get a vaccine as soon as it becomes available?
I would do, because it will have gone through proper safety tests. I think the reason we've got that figure in the middle there of leaving it for a while is because people are not sure that it's been safely tested. But let me assure it, if it's been done here, it will have been safely tested.
So we're not cutting corners?
I'm sure we're not cutting corners. It's the right thing to do. What it does indicate is maybe there's an increasing lack of trust, and that's something we can perhaps talk about more.
But that's exactly, you know, feeds into what we did want to talk about, was do you think people have lost trust in scientists? Obviously, trust in politicians has been eroded over many years, but do you think people are losing trust in scientists as a result of what's been happening?
I think they have lost trust in scientific advice, and they've lost trust in the politicians. Let's just dig into it. Part of it, I think, has been almost the relentless optimism. We're going to be world beaters. We're going to have a vaccine by September. We're going to have 100,000 tests by the end of the month. All these things were missed. In the end, the public will stop trusting both the politicians and the scientific advisors who are giving advice to those politicians. And that's very, very serious, because the public are not stupid. They should be treated as grown-ups. I published something with Maurice Saatchi on trust in science and telling people how it really is. Back to the one-liners. You have a one-liner, you claim something, it disappears in 2 weeks. Who trusts you afterwards? We rely now on the trust of the people in their leaders and in the scientists, and they've lost it.
I mean, it's so interesting, you did some work with Maurice Saatchi, a very well-known Tory supporter. You're a Labour supporter.
Yes, I'm Labour.
I mean, one of the things that we have seen, I think, in the last week, is actually a resumption of sort of normal party politics over how we deal with this crisis. I mean, I'm quite worried that actually the more it becomes about party politics and the less about what's in the common national interest, the less compliance we'll see with the rules.
I'm a bit worried about it because these sorts of conversations, we've just seen it, rapidly is reduced to ideological things. And I don't think that is quite right, to be perfectly honest. What we want is a system that works. And if we start throwing things at each other over ideologies, that isn't going to be good. I mean, if we look at the testing and tracing, I mean, the one thing we have to ask ourselves is why was the decision taken to have big centralised laboratories? We haven't heard about that. We haven't seen it. What we do know is that it was impossible to set them up quickly enough to deal with the first peak. There were almost no tests. Now, who made that decision? I mean, it was daft. What they could have done is invested locally, and that could have been got going in weeks, just as we did in the crick.
I mean, certainly, I think most people would say we were too slow as a nation to expand testing capacity. But where we are now, do you think these huge labs are appropriate for what we want to do?
I've always thought we needed the big labs, but to rely only on the big labs was the big strategic mistake. You need to have high-quality local service rapidly, where the focus on numbers misses one important point. How long does it take to get that data back? And we can do it in 12 hours because we're acting locally. The big labs might do it in 2 days. They might take 3 days. That's OK for community testing because you don't need that safety. But we support NHS and hospitals and care homes where there's vulnerable people. We have to get back to them quickly and accurately. You need a combination of local work. We do it by volunteers. People in my institution are volunteering to do it just because there is such a need to get it on the ground. There is a need for those big labs. Don't misunderstand me. But there is a need for local work to get quick returns and rapid and accurate returns.